Professor Gorlin, I simply cannot believe what I'm seeing. The voice of Trevner Zim, my most promising xenobiology student, interrupted my peaceful observation of the newest additions to our Galactic University. His three primary eye stalks were quivering with what I recognized as distress, the violet membranes fluttering rapidly. What seems to be the problem, Trevner? I asked, placing my datapad down. As head xenobiologist at the most prestigious educational institution in the Andromeda Milky Way exchange program, I'd grown accustomed to students being shocked by interspecies differences. The human student is. He trailed off, mandibles clicking in what I recognized as extreme agitation. Perhaps you should just come see for yourself, Professor. With a sigh that rustled my respiratory frills, I heaved my considerable bulk from my hoverchair. Humans were one of the newest species admitted to the exchange, and despite my extensive preparation lectures, their presence was causing quite the stir. Classified as Deathworlders, organisms evolved on high-gravity, high-oxygen planets with extreme temperature variations and abundant predators. Humans possessed bewildering physiological adaptations that frequently alarmed my more sheltered students. Lead the way, Trevner. The corridors of Galactic University Station buzzed with activity as we passed through the central atrium. Students from over 300 species mingled under the artificial sunlight, designed to accommodate the broadest spectrum of photosynthetic needs. I nodded to Professor Quabbalax, who was demonstrating proper gravitational adjustment protocols to a group of methane-breathing Ventosians. There, Trevner pointed with his uppermost appendage toward the recreational area. The human is attacking another student. I extended my eye stalks to their full height and focused on the scenario unfolding across the chamber. A small crowd had gathered around something I couldn't quite see. "Excuse me," I rumbled, using my size advantage to clear a path through the onlookers. What I saw stopped me cold. That a human female, Danielle Jackson, if I recalled correctly from the enrollment roster, was kneeling beside the prone form of Hlaxti, one of our Prolaxian exchange students. The feline-adjacent species was known for their delicate respiratory systems and tendency toward dramatic allergic reactions. Hlaxti appeared to be in full anaphylactic shock, his normally sleek fur standing on end, breathing passages visibly constricted. But what had horrified my students wasn't Hlaxti's medical emergency. It was the human's response. "What are you doing to him?" shrieked Zilvax, a Lumidarian whose light-emitting organs were currently flashing emergency patterns in distress. "You are stabbing him." Indeed, the human had just plunged something that looked suspiciously like a primitive projectile into Hlaxti's upper thigh region. "It's an EpiPen," Danielle explained calmly, while holding the injection in place. "He's having an anaphylactic reaction. This is epinephrine. It will keep his airways open until medical staff arrive." You punctured his protective dermal layer with a weapon. Another student, Brex 9, was frantically waving his sensory tendrils in what our species considered the universal sign for imminent catastrophe. The human rolled her eyes. "It's not a weapon, it's medicine. And if I hadn't done it, he'd be dead in about 2 minutes. Now someone call your medical team, or whatever you have here, because this is just a temporary fix." I stepped forward. "Medical response has been summoned," I assured her, having activated my emergency communicator. "Students, please remain calm. Human Jackson is performing emergency medical intervention appropriate for this situation." "But Professor," gasped Trevner, "she violated his body's sanctity without consultation, with a piercing implement." Danielle looked up at me, her peculiar flat face arranged in what I'd come to recognize as exasperation. "Is piercing someone to save their life really such a big deal to you folks?" Before I could respond, Hlaxti's breathing eased slightly, the terrible wheezing subsiding as the human medication took effect. The medical team arrived moments later, hovering in on their emergency platform. "What happened?" demanded Chief Medical Officer Plexvorn, her diagnostic appendages already extending toward the patient. "Anaphylaxis," Danielle said matter-of-factly. "I administered 0.3 milligrams of epinephrine about 90 seconds ago. He needs oxygen support and probably a secondary anti-inflammatory." Plex Vorn froze, her usually fluid movements halting in shocked recognition. You introduced a foreign substance directly into his circulatory system without genetic compatibility analysis. Well, yeah, Danielle shrugged. It was either that or watch him suffocate. Basic first aid. Basic first aid. The medical officer's voice modulator hit a pitch I'd never heard before. You bypassed all safety protocols and saved his life. I interjected quietly. Let's continue this discussion after Halaxty receives proper medical attention, shall we? As the medical team stabilized and transported Halaxty away, I noticed something extraordinary. The human, Danielle, showed no signs of the trauma response I would expect after such an incident. No elevated respiration, no distress coloration, no defensive posturing. She simply wiped her hands on her clothing, retrieved her backpack, and prepared to continue with her day as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Professor," she said, looking directly at me with those unsettlingly forward-facing predator eyes, "you might want to tell your students that humans carry emergency medical supplies as standard practice. This won't be the last time one of us has to intervene in a crisis." The gathered students recoiled at her directness. Such casual acknowledgement of potential future emergencies. Typical Deathworlder mentality. "Perhaps," I suggested carefully, "you could participate in our next xenobiology lecture. It might help prevent misunderstandings if students understood human emergency response protocols." "Sure thing," she nodded. "Just remember to warn them that it gets way more invasive than an EpiPen. Wait until they see chest compressions or an emergency tracheotomy." With that cheerful threat, she departed, leaving behind a classroom of thoroughly traumatized xenobiology students. "Professor Gorlin," whispered Trevner, his voice trembling, "did she just imply they sometimes break other species' skeletal structures? As medicine, I believe," I said slowly, "we have much to learn about our new human classmates." 2 solar cycles later, I found myself in the uncomfortable position of mediator at what the administrative board had termed an interspecies medical ethics discussion. In reality, it was more of a tribunal, with Danielle Jackson seated at one end of our circular conference chamber, facing the combined scrutiny of the university's senior medical staff, several department heads, and a thoroughly rattled student representative council. "Let me understand this correctly," began Chancellor Voxtrimillion, his ceremonial headpiece vibrating with barely contained agitation. "You carry weapons specifically designed to penetrate protective dermal layers." Danielle sighed. "They are not weapons, they are medical devices. And yes, humans generally carry basic first aid supplies, especially in unfamiliar environments." "Define basic first aid," requested Medical Officer Plexvorn, who had insisted on attending despite still being visibly disturbed by the previous day's events. "Well," Danielle began, reaching for her bag, "I personally carry this emergency kit, which includes bandages, antiseptic pain relievers, an EpiPen like the one I used yesterday, a compression bandage for sprains or breaks, a small suture kit for serious cuts." "Suture kit," interrupted Professor Zalbin of Technological Ethics. "You mean threading material through flesh? Like sewing?" Danielle blinked slowly. "Yes. How else would you close a serious wound quickly in an emergency?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the room as the assembled academics contemplated this barbarity. I noticed several appendages unconsciously moving to protect vulnerable body parts. "In most civilized species," Plexvorn explained frostily, "wounds are sealed with biocompatible adhesives or molecular bonding fields. We would never consider puncturing tissues repeatedly with a foreign object." "Well, that sounds nice," Danielle replied, "but humans don't typically walk around with molecular bonding field in our pockets. We make do with what we have. And what you have is surprisingly primitive and alarmingly invasive," noted Chancellor Voxtrimillion. "I understand that as a Deathworlder species, your physiological resilience is exceptional, but surely there are less traumatic interventions available." Danielle leaned forward, and I recognized the expression that humans displayed when entering what they called lecture mode. "Chancellor, with all due respect, Human first aid developed precisely because our homeworld is dangerous. When someone is bleeding out, having a severe allergic reaction, or suffering cardiac arrest, the priority is keeping them alive by any means necessary. Yes, our methods might seem extreme to species evolved in more forgiving environments, but they work. But the psychological damage, protested Professor Zalbin. Surely the trauma of such invasive procedures. Danielle actually laughed at this, a sharp sound that made several council members recoil. Sorry, but when the alternative is death, most humans are pretty okay with a little temporary discomfort or even pain. We are pragmatic that way. I decided it was time to intercede before relations deteriorated further. Perhaps we might benefit from understanding the hierarchy of human emergency response. Danielle, could you explain when different interventions are considered appropriate? She nodded gratefully. Sure. We follow what we call the ABC principle: airway, breathing, circulation. First, ensure the airway is clear. If it's blocked and can't be cleared manually, yes, in extreme cases we might perform a tracheotomy, creating a temporary airway through the neck. Several gasps echoed around the room. For breathing issues, like with Hlaxty yesterday, we administer appropriate medications or provide rescue breathing. Rescue breathing? Interrupted a student representative. Mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Using our own respiratory system to force air into someone who can't breathe independently. The color drained from several council members' faces. And for circulation problems, we perform chest compressions, rhythmically compressing the chest to manually pump blood through the body if the heart stops. You forcibly compress the thoracic cavity, whispered Plexvorn. Deliberately, about 2 inches deep, at a rate of 100 to 120 compressions per minute, Danielle confirmed matter-of-factly. And yes, it often breaks ribs. That's actually normal and expected. The silence that followed was profound. And humans willingly allow other humans to do these things to them, asked Chancellor Voxtrimillion finally. In most human jurisdictions, consent is assumed in life-threatening emergencies, Danielle explained. We even have laws protecting emergency responders from liability when they act in good faith. What about interspecies differences? I asked, genuinely curious. Surely you recognize that what works for humans might be fatal for other species? For the first time, Danielle looked somewhat chastened. That's a fair point, Professor. Humans are taught to be careful with unknown species. But with Hlaxty, I recognized anaphylaxis. It presents similarly across many oxygen-breathing vertebrate analogs. The basic mechanism of epinephrine works for a wide range of species because it targets receptors that evolved early and are highly conserved. Her technical knowledge impressed me. Perhaps there was more to human medicine than brutality and desperation. I propose, I said carefully, that rather than prohibiting human emergency response, which would be impractical given their instinctive reaction to crises, we establish an interspecies medical protocol database. Human students can contribute their knowledge, and our medical staff can determine safe equivalencies or alternatives for different species. An excellent suggestion, Professor Gorlin, agreed the Chancellor, clearly relieved to have a constructive proposal. Ms. Jackson, would you be willing to help document human first aid techniques with appropriate warnings regarding species compatibility? Absolutely, Danielle said. And if it helps, I can demonstrate some techniques on human analog dummies. Seeing the procedures might be less shocking than just hearing descriptions. I think that would be educational. I agreed, noting the mixture of horror and fascination on my colleagues' faces. Though perhaps we should prepare the audience thoroughly beforehand. As the meeting adjourned, Danielle approached me privately. Professor Gorlin, I wanted to thank you for mediating. I didn't realize how disturbing our medical practices would seem to non-Deathworlders. Different evolutionary pressures lead to different solutions, I replied philosophically. Though I must admit, I'm curious. Do all humans share your composure when facing medical emergencies? A strange expression crossed her face. What I would later learn was called a grimace. Hardly, she admitted. I'm actually a third-year medical student specializing in emergency medicine. Most humans would be pretty freaked out having to use an EpiPen on someone, let alone perform more invasive procedures. I blinked all four of my eyes in succession. You were a medical professional? That wasn't in your exchange student file. Well, technically I'm here studying xenolinguistics, she explained with a gesture I recognized as sheepishness. Medicine is just my primary degree. I'm hoping to become a xenomedical specialist eventually, someone who can bridge the gap between human and alien medicine. Looking at this small, seemingly fragile creature who had so calmly pierced another being's flesh to deliver life-saving medication, who carried wound-sewing equipment as casually as I carried my communication device, I felt a new appreciation for the complexity of our newest galactic neighbors. Ms. Jackson, I said solemnly, I believe you may have found your calling, though I suggest we introduce your medical techniques gradually, perhaps beginning with the less invasive options. She grinned, displaying those unsettling flat herbivore-like teeth that somehow seemed more threatening on an omnivorous Deathworlder. Fair enough, Professor. But sooner or later, they will need to learn about the really fun stuff, like field tourniquets and burn treatment. As she walked away, I couldn't help but wonder what other surprising skills our new human students might reveal. One thing was certain. The xenobiology curriculum would need significant updating. Word traveled quickly through the vast corridors of Galactic University Station. By the following cycle, there wasn't a student in the xenobiology department who hadn't heard about the humans' barbaric life-saving techniques. Attendance for my introductory lecture swelled to unprecedented numbers, with students from departments I'd never interacted with cramming into the amphitheater. Today, I announced to the packed auditorium, we have a special presentation on human emergency medical response protocols. I must warn you that some demonstrations may be distressing to certain species. Empathic filters are activated, and psychological support drones are stationed in all four quadrants. Danielle stood calmly next to a collection of oddly shaped objects she'd assembled on the demonstration table. The human appeared completely unbothered by the hundreds of eyes, visual sensors, and other sensory organs fixed upon her. In the front row, I noticed Medical Officer Plex Vorn and Chancellor Vox Trimillion, both radiating intense scientific curiosity despite their obvious discomfort. Thanks for coming, Danielle began with remarkable casualness. I understand that human medical interventions might seem extreme to many of you, but there's solid science behind everything we do. Today, I will walk you through some common emergency procedures, starting with the least invasive. She held up a small fabric square. This is a simple bandage. We use it to cover wounds, protecting them from contamination and absorbing blood or other fluids. Several students visibly relaxed. This seemed reassuringly straightforward. For more severe bleeding, we apply pressure bandages, she continued, demonstrating on a model limb she'd borrowed from the medical department. The goal is to create enough pressure to slow or stop blood loss until proper medical treatment is available. So far, so reasonable. I began to hope the session might proceed without incident. Now, for broken bones, we use splints and casts to immobilize the area, Danielle explained, showing various devices. The important thing is preventing movement that could cause further damage. Chancellor Vox Trimillion raised an appendage. These methods seem sensible and non-invasive. Perhaps we overreacted to your previous demonstration. Danielle smiled politely. We're just getting started, Chancellor. These are for minor to moderate injuries. Let's move on to what happens when things get more serious. The mood in the room shifted perceptibly. This, she said, holding up a small kit, is for suturing wounds. When adhesives won't work, usually due to excessive bleeding or wound location, we physically close the wound with thread and needle. A collective shudder ran through the audience. You deliberately create additional punctures? Asked Zilvax, the Lumidarian whose light organs were already beginning to pulse with distress patterns. Yes, but in a controlled pattern that allows the wound to heal properly, Danielle explained. Without closure, many wounds would continue bleeding or become infected. The temporary discomfort prevents longer-term problems. Fascinating adaptation. I commented, try to maintain a scholarly tone. The willingness to endure immediate pain for long-term survival benefit is quite consistent with Deathworld evolutionary psychology. Danielle gave me an appreciative nod before continuing. Now, let's discuss CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. This is what we do when someone's heart stops beating. She approached a full-sized human analog dummy laid out on a table. First, check for responsiveness. If there's none, check for breathing. If there's no breathing, begin chest compressions immediately. Without hesitation, she positioned her hands on the dummy's chest and began forcefully compressing downward, creating visible deformation of the thoracic cavity. You need to compress at least 2 inches deep for an adult human, she explained, continuing the rhythmic motions. As I mentioned yesterday, this often breaks ribs, but that's better than the alternative death. A Floatian student promptly lost consciousness and had to be escorted out by a medical drone. Between compressions, we may perform rescue breathing, Danielle continued, demonstrating by tilting the dummy's head back and placing her mouth directly on the simulation device's face opening. This manually forces oxygen into the lungs. You exchange respiratory secretions? Gasped a horrified Trevner. Deliberately? In emergency situations, yes, Danielle confirmed. Though nowadays, many humans carry barrier devices for protection. Professor Zalbin, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke. The physical resilience required to withstand such procedures is remarkable. Do these interventions not cause significant additional trauma? They certainly can, Danielle acknowledged. But they are only used when the alternative is death. A human with broken ribs from CPR might be in pain for weeks, but they are alive to complain about it. A decidedly practical perspective, I observed. Necessity breeds practicality, she replied. Which brings me to some of our more advanced emergency techniques. The room tensed collectively. This, she said, holding up a small, sharp object, is for emergency tracheotomy. When the upper airway is completely obstructed and can't be cleared, we create a new airway directly through the neck. A ripple of horrified murmurs swept through the auditorium. You deliberately breach the protective exterior and the respiratory system, whispered Plexvorn, her professional composure finally cracking. Only as an absolute last resort, Danielle assured her. But yes, sometimes creating a controlled injury is necessary to prevent death. But the pain, protested a Mintipod student from the back row. Pain is temporary, Danielle said with a shrug. Death isn't. The simple statement hung in the air, profound in its brutal pragmatism. I think, Chancellor Voxtramillion said carefully, we are beginning to understand why humans are classified as Deathworlders. Not merely because of your planet's conditions, but because of the psychological adaptations required to survive there. That's perceptive, Chancellor, Danielle nodded. Humans don't just tolerate emergency medical interventions. Our entire medical history is built on gradually accepting more invasive procedures as we discover their benefits. From primitive surgery without anesthesia to modern trauma care, we have always been willing to endure short-term suffering for survival. I observed the room carefully. Beyond the expected horror, I detected something else in many students' reactions, a dawning respect. The sheer determination to survive embedded in human medical practices spoke to something universal across sentient species. That concludes our basic overview, Danielle finished. Are there any questions? Nearly every appendage in the room raised simultaneously. 3 local days later. I was enjoying a rare moment of tranquility in the university's central botanical garden when Trevner found me again, agitation vibrating through his eye stalks. Professor Gorlin, it's happening again. I suppressed a sigh. What exactly is happening, Trevner? The humans. They're doing their procedures. In the zero-gravity recreation sphere. This was unexpected. I hurried after my student, wondering what new Deathworlder horror awaited us. The recreation sphere was one of the station's most popular facilities, a large zero-gravity environment where students could experience movement unbound by directional force, particularly beneficial for species with limited mobility on their homeworlds. As we approached, I noticed a crowd gathered at the observation window. Inside the sphere, several figures floated freely, among them Danielle Jackson and two other human students I recognized from the exchange program. What caught my attention wasn't the humans, however, but their companion, a Gravitax named Pulvin, whose species evolved on a super-heavy world with crushing gravity on their home world. Gravitax moved in slow, deliberate patterns, their dense musculature and reinforced skeletal structures built for withstanding tremendous pressure. Here in zero gravity, they typically moved with extreme caution, their bodies unaccustomed to unrestrained motion. Pulvin, however, was spinning uncontrollably in the center of the sphere, limbs flailing in what was clearly a panic response. The Gravitax lost control of his motion stabilizers, explained a nearby Ventosian student. Can't reorient himself. Been spinning for nearly 6 minutes. The humans noticed first. As I watched, the three humans conferred briefly, then began coordinating with surprising efficiency. One positioned herself in Pulvin's trajectory, while the other two moved to different positions in the sphere. What were they planning? I wondered aloud, just as Danielle intercepted the spinning Gravitax. Instead of avoiding collision, as most species would instinctively do, she deliberately allowed contact, wrapping her limbs around Pulvin while absorbing his momentum. The impact looked painful. Gravitax body density was significantly higher than human, but she maintained her grip, using her own body as a brake to slow his rotation. She's stabilizing him, I realized, both impressed and concerned. The force required to stop a panicking Gravitax could easily fracture human bones. Once the spin slowed, the other humans approached. Together, they maneuvered Pulvin toward the sphere's exit, using what appeared to be practiced movements to maintain control in zero gravity. They're performing a rescue, I explained to the gathered students. Quite effectively, I might add. As the group reached the airlock, medical staff waited to assist. Pulvin emerged looking disoriented but unharmed. The humans followed, Danielle wincing visibly as she rotated her shoulder. I approached as a medical drone scanned her for injuries. Minor tissue damage, reported the drone. Recommended treatment. Analgesic application and 26 hours of immobilization. I will take the painkillers, but I can't do the immobilization, Danielle replied matter-of-factly. I have 3 classes tomorrow. You appear to have injured yourself assisting Pulvin. I observed. She shrugged, then grimaced at the movement. Minor shoulder strain. Worth it to prevent him from continuing in panic mode. In zero-G, a spinning person can get seriously dehydrated and disoriented if they can't stop themselves. You have had training for zero-gravity rescue? I asked, genuinely curious. Basic training, yes. All 3 of us took the elective emergency response course before coming to the station. She gestured to her fellow humans, who were recounting the incident to an increasingly fascinated group of students. You anticipated needing such skills. Professor Gorlin, she said with that peculiar expression humans called a wry smile. Humans prepare for emergencies wherever we go. It's kind of our thing. Before I could respond, Pulvin approached, his massive form moving cautiously in the station's artificial gravity. Human Danielle, he rumbled in the characteristic low frequency of his species. You sustained damage preventing my injury. Just a strain, she assured him. I will be fine in a few days. Nevertheless, you purposefully intercepted my mass with your significantly frilier form. This is not behavior I understand, but behavior I appreciate. To my surprise, the Gravitax extended a formal gesture of life-debt acknowledgement, an extremely rare cultural response from his normally reserved species. Happy to help, Danielle replied simply. Anyone would have done the same. This is factually incorrect, Pulvin stated. Most species would have calculated the risk to themselves as prohibitive. Your actions were statistically anomalous. I noticed the gathering crowd had grown silent, watching this exchange with intense interest. Perhaps, I suggested, this exemplifies what we have been discussing in xenobiology. Different evolutionary paths create different instinctive responses to danger. For humans, evolved on a high-threat world, Immediate intervention despite personal risk appears to be a standard behavioral pattern. It is most efficient, agreed Pulvin. While unusual, it has evident survival advantages for social groups. As the crowd dispersed and medical staff finished treating Danielle's injury, I found myself contemplating the broader implications of what we were witnessing. The human approach to emergency response, direct, physical, often invasive, but undeniably effective, represented something fundamentally different from the careful, technology-dependent methods favored by most advanced species. You know, Danielle said thoughtfully as she adjusted the medical patch on her shoulder, I think there's been a misunderstanding about human first aid. Everyone focuses on how invasive or painful our methods can be, but that's missing the point, which is, I prompted. The point isn't the procedures themselves, it's the willingness to help, even when it's messy or imperfect. Humans don't perform emergency medicine because we enjoy causing pain or because we are unnecessarily brutal. We do it because sometimes imperfect help is better than perfect non-intervention. Her words resonated with unexpected wisdom. Perhaps there was something profound to learn from these Deathworlders and their direct approach to crisis. One standard month later, I stood before the university board, presenting my proposal for a new addition to the curriculum. The Interspecies Emergency Response Protocols course would combine traditional emergency medicine with the newly documented human methodologies, I explained. Students would learn which approaches are appropriate for which species, with emphasis on both technological and manual intervention options. Chancellor Voxtrimillion looked thoughtful. And you believe this course would benefit our student population? Without question, I confirmed. In the month since Human Jackson's demonstration, we have documented 7 incidents where human emergency response prevented serious injury or death. Most notably, the Arvanian chemical spill, where human students used their protective clothing to create improvised barriers while evacuating affected students. Medical Officer Plexvorn, who had undergone a remarkable evolution in her thinking, added, the human's willingness to engage physically with emergencies provides a valuable complement to our technology-dependent approaches. There are scenarios where direct intervention, despite its seemingly primitive nature, is more effective than waiting for optimal solutions. What are the cultural concerns? Asked Professor Zalbin. Many species find physical interventions deeply distressing, which is why education is essential, I replied. Understanding the rationale behind different approaches helps overcome instinctive aversion. Additionally, we have found that preferences shift dramatically when individuals are actually facing life-threatening emergencies. Even species with strong body sanctity taboos tend to accept intervention when the alternative is death. The board members exchanged glances, communicating in the subtle ways of their respective species. We have another consideration, announced the Chancellor. Since the humans joined our exchange program, emergency response time has decreased by 37%, and positive outcomes have increased by 24%. These statistics cannot be ignored. There is also, added Plexvorn, the matter of the petition. She activated a projection showing thousands of names and identifiers. Over 60% of the student population has formally requested expanded emergency response training, specifically including human methodologies. I hadn't known about this development. That's unprecedented student engagement. Indeed, agreed the Chancellor. It seems your human students have made quite an impression. The final vote was unanimous. The course would be added to the curriculum immediately, with Danielle Jackson and her fellow human students serving as guest instructors alongside our medical staff. As the meeting concluded, I found myself reflecting on how quickly perspectives had evolved. What had initially horrified us, the direct, physical, sometimes painful interventions that humans consider basic first aid, had come to be recognized as valuable alternative approaches to emergency response. Later that day, I invited Danielle to my office to share the news. So I'm going to be teaching, she said with obvious pleasure. That's fantastic, though I'm not sure how well some species will adapt to certain techniques. We will modify as needed, I assured her. The principles are what matter most. The willingness to act decisively in emergencies, even when perfect solutions aren't available. That's very human of you, Professor, she noted with apparent approval. Perhaps humans aren't the only ones who can adapt, I replied. Your species has taught us something valuable about balancing caution with action. She nodded thoughtfully. Before coming here, I worried that non-Deathworlders might see humans as unnecessarily aggressive or primitive because of how we approach emergency situations. I never expected our methods would be embraced this way. The universe is full of surprises, I agreed. Though I must ask, are there any other human emergency practices we should prepare the faculty for before they appear unexpectedly in some future crisis? Her expression shifted to what humans called a mischievous grin. While there's always wilderness medicine, battlefield triage, improvised tools in resource-limited settings, my respiratory frills fluttered in resignation. Perhaps we should schedule a private briefing for medical staff first. Probably wise, she agreed, especially before anyone sees a tourniquet application or a field amputation. I deliberately chose not to ask for details as Danielle left my office. I added a personal note to my xenobiology research journal. While much attention has been focused on the physical adaptations that allow humans to survive their death world origin, their endurance, resilience, and damage resistance, perhaps their most significant adaptation is psychological. The capacity to make difficult choices unhesitatingly when survival is at stake. Other species may possess more advanced technology, more specialized biological features, or more refined cultural practices, but humans possess something rarer: the ability to act decisively in crises, accepting imperfect solutions when perfect ones aren't available. In studying these Deathworlders, we may learn not just about their unusual physiology or their surprising resilience, but about a fundamentally different approach to facing the universe's dangers. One where direct intervention, even at personal cost, is valued over perfect but delayed solutions. And perhaps, in teaching us their methods, they might learn something from us as well, that not all problems require the direct, physical approach they favor, that sometimes patience and technological solutions have advantages too. This exchange of methodologies may be the most valuable outcome of all. As I finalized my notes, the station's emergency alert system activated. The calm artificial voice announced, "Minor atmospheric regulation failure in Section 12B. All vulnerable species, please evacuate to designated safe zones. Human Emergency Response Team, please report to Section 12B." I smiled to myself. Only a month ago, such an announcement would have seemed bizarre, calling specifically for human assistance. But now it felt perfectly natural that our newest, most unusual students had found their niche in our community. Different evolutionary paths, different solutions, but ultimately, all serving the same goal: survival. Perhaps that was the most important lesson these Deathworlders had to teach.